Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Anna Skarbek, CEO at Climateworks Centre, and I'll be your host for today's briefing room webinar on credible transition planning. Last month, Climateworks released its guide to credibility for corporate climate transition plans, aiming to bridge the gap between companies' targets and how they get there. In today's session, we're going to hear from the authors of this guide, as well as from Jacques Morris from the International Transition Plan Network. But first, let's begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands from which each of us is dialing in today. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and the waters of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And I also extend my respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders joining us today. Welcome and thank you. For those of you online, please feel free to tell us to use the chat to tell us where you're dialing in from. And in the chat, you'll soon see a link to the guide that we'll be discussing today. It includes references to the new legislation that's now operating in Australia on mandatory climate-related financial reporting regime for large companies. Looking forward to getting into this discussion. Over the last few years, we've seen momentum growing for climate action in the corporate sector. Net zero targets are now business as usual, but how companies plan to get there is not yet. Corporate transition plans are emerging as the primary means for companies to demonstrate how they plan to prepare for and contribute to the global transition to net zero. And while transition plans are not yet mandatory, investors, banks and consumers increasingly expect companies to disclose one. And so with the bar for climate action being raised and increasing greenwashing allegations, the credibility of transition plans really counts and is an opportunity to set off on the right path. A credible transition plan can demonstrate a company's genuine commitment to reducing emissions, enhancing their competitive advantage, long-term value and investor confidence. So over the next hour, you'll hear from our guests today. Charlie Turner, my colleague, who is going to give us a rundown of how transition plans fit in with climate-related financial disclosures in Australia, the legislation that I mentioned, and talk about why credible transition plans matter. Next, you'll hear from another of my colleagues, Charlotte Mills, who will give us an overview of Climateworks' credibility guide. And then finally, we'll have a fireside chat with Jacques Morris, who's going to share a global perspective. And then, as a reminder, we'll be taking your questions a little bit later on. And so please submit them anytime via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So let's get into it. Without further ado, I'm keen to introduce to you all Charlie Turner. Charlie's a senior project manager in Climateworks' Sustainable Corporates team, where she focuses on embedding credibility in corporate climate planning and corporate climate accountability. Previously, Charlie was a practicing lawyer, specialising in climate and sustainability risk governance and climate-related mandatory reporting and litigation. Over to you, Charlie.
Thank you, Anna, and welcome everyone today. So, to reflect the urgent need for the global economy to reach net zero by 2050 in order to meet the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement, many economies around the world have adopted or committed to adopting mandatory climate-related disclosure regimes. And as Anna mentioned, we now have one of those regimes in Australia, which came into effect in January, with the disclosures to be made in accordance with the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standards, ASSB S2, which largely mirrors the international sustainability standards that have been taken up globally, save for a few changes to make it appropriate for the Australian market. The Australian standard very much mirrors the international market, and the regime here is being phased in under a staged approach, starting with Group 1 entities who represent the largest emitters and corporations in Australia, and then progressively smaller companies are being phased in over the next few years. And for that first cohort, they'll be preparing and filing their sustainability reports as part of their annual reporting suite for FY 25-26. And companies subject to the disclosure regime will be required to disclose information about a transition plan if they have one, And this is in order for the users of sustainability reports to understand the effects of the climate-related risks and opportunities, and the risks being the physical risks and the economic transition risks presented by climate change, and the effects of those risks and opportunities on the company's strategy and its decision-making. Now, ASSB S2, the standard, doesn't strictly require a company to publish a transition plan if they don't have one. However, it does inherently require disclosures that are relevant to the company's climate-related transition. It requires material information about the climate risks and opportunities that could be reasonably expected to affect the entity's prospects, and in turn disclosures about how the company has responded to and how it plans to respond to these risks and opportunities. And so, in other words, it's strategy to manage those identified and disclosed risks. And so this includes information in the reporting regime about the anticipated changes to business model, both mitigation and adaptation efforts, as well as how the entity plans to achieve any climate-related targets. So even in the absence of a formal transition plan, the transition planning process itself is not only good business planning, but it actually needs to be undertaken in order to provide fulsome decision-useful information as to the company's strategy to mitigate and manage climate-related risks and capitalize on those opportunities. A climate transition plan is the company's strategic plan to contribute to and prepare for the transition to a low greenhouse gas emissions economy and demonstrate the entity's long-term profitability and resilience. And transition planning, as Anna alluded to at the beginning, has really moved now from a risk management tool to a strategic imperative. And this is largely due to the current, as we're already seeing, especially here in Australia, and anticipated physical risks to both assets and supply chains, and also driven by significant shifts in operating and regulatory environments as economies transition to a low carbon environment. So companies that are taking that beyond compliance approach and proactively integrating climate into their overall business strategy can position themselves not only to manage the risk, but capitalize on the opportunities that a low carbon economy presents. And these companies will then be well placed to navigate the reporting regime and alleviate greenwashing concerns. And so the plan details the response to the risks and opportunities and how that climate strategy will be integrated with long-term business strategy, the core business planning, and the financing of both the plan itself and the capex and investment required in order for the company to continue to operate and remain competitive in a low carbon economy. And a range of stakeholders are now increasingly expecting clear climate strategies to understand how a particular entity will maintain long-term resilience and profitability. And a transition plan offers a great way to communicate the company's climate ambitions and detail the roadmap that the actions the company will take to realize these ambitions, and importantly includes the accountability and robust governance mechanisms for successful implementation. And as Anna mentioned at the beginning, there's been a proliferation of net zero targets in the corporate community, which really recognizes that companies must take climate risk into account to remain competitive. And as investor pressure ramps up and the regulatory environment evolves and the market matures, what is now an essential component of those targets is the level of ambition and the credibility of how a company plans to achieve them, moving from ambition stage to action. And credible transition planning and disclosure also includes the key assumptions and dependencies underpinning them, and the progress towards any targets made to date, and whether or not this has included the appropriate or not use of carbon credits and or an over-reliance on unproven technologies. So as well as a proliferation in net zero targets, globally there has been an uptick in companies publishing transition plan information. However, there does still remain a gulf between the number of companies with targets and what would be deemed a credible robust, transparent, actionable plan to achieve them, and therefore not credible enough to support global emissions reductions in line with the Paris Agreement or provide decision useful information. A CPD study in 2023 found that of a huge number of corporates that had actually disclosed transition plans in that year, a small percentage of them were assessed to be credible. And this lack of credibility leads to things such as greenwashing concerns, increased risk exposure on the spectrum of financial, both access to capital and the retention of good capital, legal risks that are broader than the greenwashing, go across the spectrum, including directors' duties and potential exposure for breach of those, and of course the reputational and social license risks. And without credibility in the transition planning process, inadequate decision making leading to perverse outcomes or locking into long-term assets or contracts might be made. And so a credible transition plan enables entities and investors to manage and properly price in risks, and will better highlight where those transition risks and opportunities within the economy and particular sectors are. So a credible transition plan is first and foremost one that actually leads to emissions reductions required to meet the temperature goals in the Paris Agreement. As we know, despite there being a large number of corporate climate targets, this has not yet resulted in the real world emissions reductions to hold global warming to 1.5. So turning that ambition into action is really critical. And through the research that we undertook to prepare our report, we found sort of three key principles that really capture credibility within the target setting ambition phase, the action and sort of implementation and integration throughout the business, and then the accountability mechanisms through the iterative process of transition planning and key governance structures. And so to be sufficiently ambitious with the Paris Agreement, there has to be an appropriate decarbonisation pathway, and the implementation of the plan needs to be feasible, considering both the external operating environment of the company, so that external feasibility, and the policy and environment that it's operating in, as well as the internal feasibility, the company's capabilities, capacity to actually deliver the plan. And through that internal consistency and integration into broader strategy, that provides confidence to the users of transition plans that the strategy will be effectively implemented and the plan will be delivered. And finally, the credible transition plan contains that information, so that the users can get a good picture and of the company's strategy and implementation, and are up to date and verifiable, providing transparent and accurate information to their users. In recent years, there's been an increase in transition plan guidance and frameworks globally. And as part of our research, we reviewed a large number of these best practice ones in the global literature, around 34, covering international regulation, frameworks and guidance on transition plans. And the purpose was to really consolidate this, provide the principles and definitions and criteria. And we developed and tested these criteria with a number of leading industry groups in Australia and climate experts to ensure that they were relevant to the Australian economy and Australian companies, but were still aligned with global best practices. And through our review, we identified 7 key criteria that are essential to ensuring the transition plan is credible. My colleague Charlotte will shortly run through these, but thank you, and back to you first, Anna.
Thank you, Charlie. And Yes, in a moment we will hear from Charlotte, but if you have any questions on what you've just heard, you can submit them in the Q&A button for us to come to after the dialogue. And I'm sure I hope that you're listening with gratitude that our team has studied all of the frameworks on that page of logos and synthesised them for you for relevance to the Australian market. So let's now hear from Charlotte to get into the detail of what that synthesis has taught us. So Charlotte is a senior analyst at Climateworks, focused on defining and disseminating best practice corporate climate strategies. In a previous role at Climateworks, Charlotte contributed to our net zero momentum tracker, assessing the emissions targets of ASX 200 companies and their alignment with a 1.5 degree future. So over to you, Charlotte. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. So Charlotte took us through the reporting landscape and discussed what credibility means and why it is so important in transition planning. I'm now going to spend a bit of time diving into the criteria. And so these are the items that companies and their stakeholders can use to check if a transition plan that they are assessing or preparing is credible. I'll be going through each of the criteria in turn, starting with criteria 1. Firstly, it is that a credible transition plan includes science-based net zero targets and supporting instrument targets that cover scope 1, 2, and relevant scope 3 emissions. Just for quickly, before we launch in, scope 1 emissions are direct emissions. Scope 2 emissions primarily refers to electricity use in Australia. And scope 3 emissions are those which occur in a company's value chain. So Paris-aligned emissions reduction targets are the foundation of a credible transition plan. They drive the direction and speed of the transformation required for a company to achieve net zero emissions. To be credible, these targets are based on Paris-aligned pathways and are ideally specific for the sector and region in which the company operates. I'll delve a little deeper into what this means in the next criteria. So criteria number 2 is that a credible transition plan sets out specific, feasible, and measurable emissions reductions actions to meet short and medium-term targets and explains how the company positions itself to meet its long-term targets. These actions are essential for a company to demonstrate that it understands how it is actually going to meet its targets, which, as Charlie mentioned, is critical in preventing greenwashing. This criterion also touches on the importance of clearly setting out assumptions and dependencies that are underpinning these actions. So transition plans are forward-looking documents and therefore will have to rely on some assumptions about internal capacity and external dependencies. Ensuring that these assumptions are evidence-based and reasonable is really important to the feasibility of the plan. And so, like targets, companies can also strengthen these assumptions by considering regional differences. These include things like infrastructure, technology, workforce availability, and policy and economic conditions, as these can massively impact the feasibility of the plan. So when considering these regional differences can be really useful for companies when considering how practical their plan will be. Now for the very simple and straightforward topic of carbon credit use in criteria 3, which is that a credible transition plan includes actions that prioritize emissions reductions within the value chain and then consider carbon credit use when appropriate. Also, just when we say value chain, we're just referring to the sequence of activities that is required for a company to do business. So this is from all the way from its suppliers and manufacturing right through to consumer use and disposal of product. Now, back to carbon credits. While carbon credits can play a complementary role in the transition, they are not a substitute for direct emissions reductions. There are a few key reasons for this. Firstly, companies are encouraged to prioritize investing in emissions reductions technologies within their value chain, so as to not miss out on any investment opportunities by spending money elsewhere. Secondly, carbon credits have a limited availability, and so it is a bit risky to rely too heavily on them. And then additionally, there are also concerns about the integrity of some carbon credits and their ability to lead to real-world emissions reductions. That being said, carbon credits do still have an important place in a credible transition plan, and so they should be used to counterbalance residual emissions at the net zero date. These are the emissions that remain after all other possible emissions reductions actions have taken place. Companies are also encouraged to use carbon credits for beyond value chain mitigation, which is a way for companies to direct additional finance to emission sequestration projects and low emissions projects that sit outside of a company's value chain or outside their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Okay, folks, I know this is a lot of content, but in good news, we are over halfway. Criteria 4 is that a credible transition plan sets out how the company integrates its strategy within the wider organizational strategy, including financial planning. There are a few key aspects to this. Firstly, does the wider organizational strategy reflect the goals of the transition plan? For example, if a company has a net zero target, but it is planning to invest in or generate significant revenues from a high emitting activity, then the company is going to be unlikely to be able to meet its targets. And this misalignment between the transition plan goals and the wider organizational strategy is like a critical sort of red flag for credibility. Another key aspect of this criteria is determining if the company has allocated enough money to the actions that it has set out in its plan, or if it has a plan to reach these funding goals. This criterion is also, I understand, very complicated, but Australian companies are actually quite well placed to meet these because they can use the ASFI taxonomy, which was released earlier this year, to support in their disclosures. Next on to criteria 5, which is that a credible transition plan details the company's engagement that may impact its emissions reductions targets. Achieving a company's climate-related target requires significant collaboration and support from all parts of the value chain, and having a robust engagement strategy can help companies navigate some of these challenges. Additionally, a credible transition plan includes how a company's policy advocacy is aligned with its targets. Companies need to demonstrate that they are using their considerable power to advocate for policies that support the global transition to net zero, and critically, that they are not backing initiatives or policies that could undermine or delay progress. Our penultimate criteria, criteria 6, which is that a credible transition plan clearly defines its governance structure, which is embedded to the company's overall governance structure. I am sure that all listeners are aware that bad governance is the downfall of so many projects that we have been a part of, and a transition plan is really no different. It needs to be able to demonstrate that the company has clear roles and responsibilities, accountability mechanisms, incentive competencies, and a supportive culture to actually deliver on its commitments. And lastly, but certainly not least, is criteria 7, which is that a credible transition plan outlines how it will be verified and maintained over time while still retaining comparability. As climate science and markets and technologies evolve, companies can regularly review and update their transition plans to maintain credibility. Sorry. Ideally, this would happen every 3 years or when there is a material change to the business. A transition plan is also ideally verified by an accredited third party to provide confidence to investors that the information in the plan is reliable, and then also to reduce greenwashing risks to the company. As we all know, climate change is deeply interconnected with broader sustainability issues, and addressing climate in isolation can have unintended or perverse consequences. It is really clear that the market is now evolving to take this into consideration, and investors are increasingly expecting companies to adopt more comprehensive sustainability strategies. Therefore, effective climate transition planning extends beyond emissions reductions to other risks and opportunities, particularly climate adaptation or adapting to a changing climate, managing impacts and dependencies on nature, and ensuring a just transition. In the guide, we also set out key considerations for companies to create a holistic approach to managing climate change. So well done, everyone. We've made it to the end. You're now all experts on credibility. Before I hand back to Anna, I just wanted to give a little taster of what the guide actually looks like. So we present the 7 criteria, which I have just talked you all through. And then each of these 7 criteria has associated sub-criteria, which can be used as sort of like a checklist when you're preparing or assessing a transition plan to determine its credibility. The report also includes some appendices. We've got some additional resources that companies can use. And then we also have a resource that maps our guide to the AASB2 standards. So companies can use that when they're doing their mandatory reporting. If you want to find out more, we encourage you to read the report. And now back to you, Anna.
Thank you, Charlotte. And if you've just joined us, welcome to Climateworks Centre's briefing room. I'm Anna Skarbek, CEO at Climateworks Centre, and we've just heard there from Charlotte Mills and before her, Charlie Turner, who together gave us an overview of corporate climate reporting in Australia and the 7 criteria in the Climateworks Guide to ensure corporate transition plans are credible and that they drive real-world emission reductions. And I want to endorse Charlotte's plug at the end there for reading the appendices in this guide. I'm not joking that they are one of the best parts of this. There is a very clear outline of those checklists there, but what we've really I think the team's been most helpful in is alongside the checklist at the back of the guide are a series of additional footnotes and references where you can find the sources of the best practice benchmarks that have been referred to and all the clauses in the ASSB2, that's the Australian Accounting Standards Board standards and frameworks that are now used and linked to the new legislation. So this really is an all-in-one guide for what's required in the legislation, what does good look like, and where do you go in the footnotes and the bibliography at the end in the appendices for the sources of where we have found the best practice, having done the global and local synthesis effort with the leading peak groups and experts in this field. So I'm very proud of the work that our team has done. It's been close to a year in the making. So well done for tuning in today to learn all about it. It's one of those cooking shows. Here's one I prepared earlier, as the legislation's only been in place for 1 month. So thank you to the team for outlining that. And I hope after this webinar, you'll enjoy delving into it. And indeed, if you are listening to this webinar on YouTube, please, you can click on the like and subscribe to our channel. So now, to hear about the global perspective, we're going to turn now to our fireside chat, or it might be breakfast time chat for you, Jacques. So Jacques Morris is joining us from London. He's the head of the International Transition Plan Network, or ITPN. And the ITPN supports global collaboration on private sector transition plans and their applications for national policies and regulations. Prior to heading up the ITPN, Jacques was the team leader for the Transition Plan Task Force Secretariat in the UK, which developed a gold standard for private sector transition plans, and this is being adopted internationally. Jacques has also held many other roles, including in the Oxford Sustainable Finance Group, the Centre for Greening Finance and Investment, and in the UK Civil Service. So firstly, let me say thank you for joining us early in your morning there, Jacques. And I'm looking forward to inviting you to share some perspectives on this work, which I know you've been closely involved in with us. So to kick it off, could you give us an overview of the momentum that you see building in relation to transition plans internationally?
Yeah, thanks so much, Anna. Thank you for having me and for the great, very kind introduction. Yeah, I mean, everything that both Charlottes have run through so far is fantastic, and we really endorse Climateworks guidance on credibility here, which we see is just really important in providing local specific guidance on credibility on transition plans. I hope you can also see me okay. We've got the UK morning sun, which is just rising above the buildings behind me, but glad to be here. So we in the ITPN, the International Transition Plan Network, we are a group of governments and regulators who are working on how transition plans can support national climate policy, including NDCs, and how transition plans mobilise finance. So we're really monitoring globally what is going on in the transition plan discussion. I think a few really key things that have come out recently. So we've seen the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, the IFRS, the Global Sustainability Reporting Body, essentially, has released transition plan guidance. And now we have, for the first time, a solid, distinctive, hopefully final set of international reporting standards guidance on transition plans. And that provides a lot of confidence to market actors, to companies who have already been using the work of the Transition Plan Task Force and the GFANZ framework to say that they will now be compliant with international reporting standards. And those standards are being adopted by around 40 countries globally. So that is just a huge endorsement for how much this is becoming a market norm, and how much regulators are working to ensure that there is international consistency. We've also seen recently the UN insurance body has released transition plan guidance for insurers, for reinsurers and for brokers as well, which is also a core missing part of the guidance piece. And we have the Network for Greening the Financial System, which is a group of central banks and supervisors, has released guidance on integrating adaptation into transition plans, which is also really crucial because a lot of the conversation on transition plans in the last couple of years has been focused on the climate side or mitigation or the emissions reduction side. And we really now have to start thinking about how we're incorporating adaptation and resilience and nature elements as well into transition planning. And I think a really key thing that we see with all of these pieces of guidance is that they are increasingly aligned. And this is where the Climateworks guidance is also really aligned to existing frameworks and assessment frameworks as well. So we're seeing, so much more momentum that is coming through this.
Thank you. That's fantastic. And to think about how plugged in you are to 40 different countries, standards and guidances on this, and really great to hear the new guidances coming out already on the next frontier beyond mitigation into adaptation, and nature being such an important element of both mitigation and adaptation. You've painted a positive picture there. I know you're very close to a lot of this action, and it's clearly an active field with a lot of expertise. But of course, if we only listened to some of the headlines and not people as close to it as you, we hear a lot from Europe and the US about a walk back from some regulations and in the corporate space around sustainability. I wonder if you might share your perspectives on the evolving international regulations and what you see in the field compared to what we might hear in the news.
Yeah. I mean, I'll start with the EU. That it's certainly been a bruising process, right? And we've been engaging with the Commission and with member states in the EU as well to support calls for keeping transition plans within the existing regulatory the directives that exist. So we got two, just to summarize, two main directives that talk about transition plans in the EU: the Due Diligence Directive, the CSDDD, and the Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD. So mandatory transition plans are still in the CSDDD, and that is the really important part here. And they still have also a requirement in there to implement the transition plan as well as to report it. So that's just a really key fact. There is a negotiation process that is still going on. So the Commission has said that mandatory transition plans will remain. The Council in June, the European Council confirmed that they would also see mandatory transition plans as staying. And now we need the European Parliament to find their position. So there's still a political negotiation going on. But what I would say aside from that is that we saw, I think a couple of weeks ago, the European reporting body, EFRAG, published a state of play of sustainability reporting from the last year under the new CSRD rules, which looked at 650 companies, and it found that 55% of those companies already have a transition plan, and that is across the whole of the EU jurisdiction. So we can really see that transition plans are becoming widespread. They are being used by companies increasingly, and the regulations here, are almost kind of catching up, but they have sent that signal a few years ago that transition plans are important. We see as well in the US, at a state level, there is some progress as well in considering the importance of transition plans, and voluntary disclosure is also happening, but we know that the politics there is also quite different. But I would say that a lot of the leadership that we see is also in Asia Pacific. It's in Australia, it's in New Zealand, and we can see that in Hong Kong, in Japan, Singapore, Indonesia, each government, each regulator is all thinking about how can they put in place versions of transition plan guidances or regulations to encourage more disclosure and ultimately make sure that investors and lenders have the information that they need, that companies are transition ready, and that policymakers and regulators can use all of that information in setting climate policy.
Thanks very much, Jacques. And that's a great segue to my next question, actually, because you've mentioned a lot of jurisdictions taking a lot of concrete action as well as leading action through guidances on exactly this field. So I wonder if you might share your perspectives on international harmonisation. You've mentioned there's a lot of alignment already of climate disclosures and transition plans. Is that international alignment good enough? And how do you see that space?
Yeah, I mean, it is really tricky, right? We expect to have a global baseline, but we also recognize the importance of jurisdictions having their own local approaches, and no two countries are the same. I mean, what I would say is viewing this through the lens of a company, of a corporate, and especially those that have multinational operations and global supply chains, having different rules in different jurisdictions creates unnecessary complexity, especially for companies who will also be required to report under different regulations from different jurisdictions. So we need consistent reporting. And that's why the work of the IFRS that I mentioned earlier is so important. And it's also great to see in Australia that the AASB has built on that. So that's a really good example of consistent reporting. And also, many of us working in the reporting space know that general similarity is not often as good as just using the same words. So that's where we've been trying to support that as much as possible. My previous work in the TPT, we strived to create a disclosure framework that could create more consistency. We are seeing the 5 elements of the TPT framework being used throughout a lot of guidance pieces that have been published recently. So that's really promising. I mean, and also from the perspective of investors, they need to be able to understand how any business is responding to risks and opportunities and making strategic decisions. As Charlotte said before, transition plan is a strategic tool. It's part of corporate strategy. It's really good to see that piece within the Climateworks guidance about the internal alignment within the organization of the transition plan. Because the transition plan is not just a compliance exercise, it's a communication of value creation and business resilience. And also, I mean, I would just say that we're starting to see, even though disclosure of transition plans is increasing, we're starting to see examples of where plans are facilitating finance and supporting competitive markets. And that's really, I think, where we start to see the magic of transition plans. And making companies transition ready, but also the finance is flowing. So just some examples that I can share. We see that transition themed funds are emerging. 63% of global investors are allocating or planning to allocate funds to transitioning companies with high emissions who also have a credible transition plan. We have emerging evidence from the University of Oxford that in the energy and utility sectors, showing that a credible transition plan and higher ESG ratings may lower the cost of debt. And in the UK, we've recently seen a survey that said that 65% of corporates think that achieving the goals of their transition plan will make them more competitive. So this whole idea that plans lead to finance is really growing, and I think we're only going to see more and more evidence of that happening now.
Fantastic. Thanks for bringing that in, which is a great opportunity for me to bring in our other panelists actually and turn to some of the questions that we've received, because there have been some on the finance topic. And I want to thank everyone who pre-submitted questions and also who've been submitting while we've been speaking. Questions have been flooding in actually, and I could say now we will not have time for all of them, I'm sure, but that's a good opportunity for another webinar. I think we clearly have appetite for a community of practice around transition planning. And isn't it handy, Jacques, that you lead an international one of those? There is, in fact, an international community of practice on transition plans. So we can share information about that, and you can rest assured that there are places to go to delve into these issues in an ongoing way. So I think you can see now on the screen, Charlotte and Charlie have rejoined us, and with Jacques, I'm going to navigate some of the questions that we have received already and do the best that we can in the next 10 minutes or so of time that we have. And you were very helpfully talking about transition plans leading to improved access to finance for firms that were credibly transitioning. And one of the questions has asked, how does the Climateworks guide to credible transition plans fit with the ASFI taxonomy? And there was a question, what is the ASFI taxonomy in Australia, that acronym? The Australian Sustainable Finance Institute, ASFI, worked with the Treasury in the federal government to establish an independent technical expert group, which developed over the course of a year, drawing on much input and consultation, a set of criteria for labelling assets and investment activities that meet the definition of credible for green or in transition. So, Charlotte, I might hand to you and to explain how does the taxonomy, which was also published last month, along with this credibility guide, how do both these two new tools fit together?
Yeah, thank you, Anna. It's a really good question. So the taxonomy, as you said, sort of creates a common language that now everyone in the industry can speak, so that when someone discloses that they have investment into or are getting revenues from a certain economic activity, everyone knows exactly what they're talking about. So that it's super useful for that. With respect to transition plans, as part of criteria 4 for a transition plan to be credible, we're expecting companies to disclose planned CapEx, OpEx, and planned revenues from certain activities so that then the users can tell how credible a company's plan is. Australian companies are really fortunate because they can use the ASFI taxonomy to underpin these disclosures, and then stakeholders will know what they're all talking about. So it just provides a common language for everyone reading transition plans to understand what the disclosures are about. It also is super useful for companies that are looking for investment opportunities. If you're in one of the 6 priority sectors and you want to look for transition or green investment opportunities, you can look at the economic activities in the ASFI report to see what is potentially available to your sector and how to actually meet them.
Yes, you can indeed. And I think we'll be able to share a link to that taxonomy, which is publicly available in the notes that we send afterwards with the references. I know there's been a request for that. And also, Jacques, there was a request for the evidence that you mentioned from Oxford. So we'll do our best to gather up the requests that are flowing in. And there's always an email that follows these webinars with the recording. So we'll include what we can in that. And indeed, we are close to that taxonomy, and the evidence that has been used to inform those criteria were based on the Paris-aligned pathways that Climateworks co-developed with CSIRO and a number of other best practice guidances that have been drawn on by that independent technical group. So it is, as Charlotte said, an excellent benchmark for what credibly meets the definition of green or in transition. So very useful for the two to come out together. A related question is, how does the credibility criteria guide fit with the transition plan task force guidance on how to make a transition plan itself? And so I wonder if, Charlie, you might like to start and Jacques might like to add.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Anna. I think firstly to say that they're really complementary. As Jacques mentions, the TPT framework focuses on the disclosure of transition plans, so guides around the things that need to be disclosed in relation to the transition plan, the information you need. Whereas the credibility guide and what we've done in our report is bring in that level of ambition and have that sort of technical information about how to use appropriate decarbonisation pathways for your company or your sector. And so I think that the two guides together are extremely complementary, and the Climateworks guide can actually be used either by preparers of transition plans, and then that information feeding into the TPT disclosure framework, or the Climateworks guide can also be used by assessors of the transition plans to look at those the levels of ambition and the credibility of the actions taken through that implementation, and so they work really nicely together.
Yeah. Jacques, is there anything you'd like to add on how you're seeing the TPT guidance used in your markets?
Yeah, I mean, just to say, like, totally agree. And the one really extra special piece that the Climateworks guidance offers is that piece on ambition. And the TPT doesn't go into ambition because it's meant to be kind of neutral for every jurisdiction. And then, we wanted to see jurisdictions then bringing in their own guidance on top of that. So this is, I think exactly how we thought that things would play out. I would also say that we are, the TPT, we are seeing, as I said, the 5 elements of that disclosure framework being used more and more frequently by companies and by financial institutions, and also being referenced in guides for sectors and from different types of regulators too.
Indeed. And something that I have found very helpful in the TPT framework is its simplicity. We at Climateworks with Monash Sustainable Development Institute teach a Net Zero Academy program, which includes credible transition planning. And I think we've got a slide on that at the end. But something we say to people who have often come through business schools, done MBAs, they're in corporate strategy roles, turning up to these programs, is you can read the TPT guidance and those core elements pretty much straight out of an MBA textbook. They are the elements of any corporate strategy. And what that guidance does is show how you bring climate into the business planning and corporate strategy and governance frameworks and employee engagement and resourcing with CapEx and OpEx. But actually, it's a tremendous illustration of what might appear complex because it's got new language in a new field, but in fact, it's grounded in what is already familiar to the corporate sector. And these new guidance tools allow us to leverage what's been taught for decades in business schools and bring best practice climate knowledge into those existing frameworks. We've got maybe time for one more question, and then we'll have to do our best to share some resources afterwards. One of the questions we had was, can organisations update commitments credibly as circumstances change? For example, if emissions are higher than first estimated. I wonder if Charlie, you might like to start there again, and then if Jacques or Charlotte have anything to add.
Yes, absolutely. And I think when we're using this term credibly and credible transition planning and disclosure, if we think back to criteria 7 that Charlotte ran us through, that sort of talks about that iterative process of transition planning, very much progress over perfection. Like, there's no expectation that a transition plan is going to include every single concrete action up to 2050 because there's so much uncertainty around. And part of good disclosure is disclosing your sort of maturity and where you're up to and progress, and as and when there are things that need to be updated, whether it's in the public context to the market because it might be price sensitive information, or if it's updated in your transition plan. There's absolutely those updates and that iterative process where there's new information, and yeah, it's part of good disclosure.
Yeah, can I just jump in there? I mean, I would say also just to build on that part of good disclosure. I mean, if we go back to Anna's previous comment and look, outside of just the climate space and good corporate strategy, good business practice, when companies change tax, they might issue a statement to explain why, and that is totally normal. And climate disclosure in this sense is part of the same approach. There's also loads of really interesting discussion on liability, legal liabilities and transition plans. In the UK recently, there was an independent legal opinion which showed that publishing a transition plan did not materially increase liability risks for firms. And essentially the key message here is that silence is risk. So that if you are actually publishing a transition plan, if that changes over time and you're explaining why, and you're explaining the dependencies that your transition plan has on policy, on technology, then that's good business practice. And it will also help mitigate liability risks too. I mean, that's in the UK context, but there are applications in other jurisdictions.
Indeed. And I think that's a really handy note to end on around normalising this, drawing analogies to what's very normal in every other field of forward-looking statements for corporations. Business strategies change and are updated. Capital raisings occur all the time with forward-looking statements where businesses are disclosing their plans and updating them. So we are excited to have worked with you, Jacques, to play a role in how to normalise climate as part of the normal course of business for business and government in practice and policy. And this is, as we said, a new field, and yet in fact it's introducing climate into an existing field of normal corporate disclosures. And we're pleased that we've reached the point now where we can see credible corporate transition planning that can align with the zero emissions future that we know is the one that keeps us all safe. So I want to use this moment to thank our panellists. You've heard today from our international guest, Jacques Morris, and our Climateworks colleagues, Charlotte Mills and Charlie Turner. And I want to thank our communications team who have been operating behind the scenes to broadcast this to you, Simon Leo Brown and Sophie Stefanakis. A great support to us on all of our webinar series. And I want to particularly thank our philanthropic funders. Climateworks is a philanthropic funded organisation, and in particular on this program, we extend a huge heartfelt appreciation to the funders of all of this work that we've been discussing today, done by Climateworks, and that's the Sequoia Climate Foundation. And as I mentioned, our team have worked really hard to be ready for this moment when the legislation was arriving, to be like those cooking shows. We really have done the work and tapped into your networks, Jacques, and the international global alliances, and convened local working groups with other industry bodies and corporate networks to understand and apply their feedback to present this in a way that's really ready to be applied. And that is thanks to philanthropy. And we do that because we know if we can make it easier, then we can accelerate the opportunity for companies to have good transition plans that can really benefit all of our progress towards the zero emissions economy that we know holds opportunity and avoids risk. So thank you to those philanthropic funders, and to any other philanthropic funders listening out there. We rely on support from donations. So if you'd like to support Climateworks, please do so via the links that we'll be sending you, and we rely on that continuously. So with that, I want to say good luck to all of you in practitioner spaces here applying this, and we look forward to helping maintain and uplift the capacity of Australian and Southeast Asian operators in net zero credible corporate transition plans, and look forward to continuing to engage with you, Jacques. All the very best. Stay tuned to Climateworks, and we look forward to supporting you further. Thanks for the support, everyone. Bye-bye.